Welcome to Sab's podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest today is Sam Husseini. He is an independent journalist writing for Substack at Husseini.substack.com, and he's the founder of votepack.org. Welcome, Sam. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me, Sabrina.
So, Sam, you get the opportunity to do something that most of us will never get the opportunity to do. You get to confront the State Department. I know many of us would like to do that at some point. I'm curious, what is the atmosphere like in those the press briefings for an independent journalist? Like, how often are you called on by members of the State Department?
It's difficult, rarely. But sometimes I inject myself into the discussion, and that's typically not welcome for me, while it is welcome for others. I should say there's been a bit of a change over the last, several months. There's generally a tenor of deference to the spokesperson, and it's they get to call on who they want to call on, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it for a little bit. So it is a bit of access journalism. And there's all kinds of different stripes of journalists there. There are a lot of journalists who are kind of like almost lobbyists for different countries. That is, they go there to represent the interests of country X and just have to, put it in the form of a question. So you have to contend with that, and some of them are just like, some of the journalists there are from tiny outlets that I know nothing about, that are very, like, why are you so easy on Iran? That kind of thing. And when I do get a question in, I'm often cut off with the spokesperson saying, going to one of those journalists who is oftentimes very eager to assist them in cutting me off.
Right. When it comes to Gaza in particular, do you think, just based on what you've seen, do you think the State Department, like people like Matt Miller and John Kirby, for example, do you think they're finally starting to see that a lot of people are not believing the rhetoric that they're saying about Gaza?
Yeah, I think it's weird. I don't think that they a lot of the time expect people to believe them. It's just a matter of, what are you going to do? That they're out there to spout the line as best they can. They're hired hands to do that, and uh, what's they spout it. They put the best face that they can on it. They evade and deceive as best they can. I think that they do sense that, even, some of the more mainstream people are not buying it as much anymore, but I don't really know that that's ever totally their goal.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've always been curious about that because I noticed a lot of times the talking points, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, is very repetitive from the State Department, especially when it comes to Israel and Gaza. They continue to say that Israel has a right to defend itself. And I've often heard of them still being pro-Israel, even when they make a statement that, Israel has to try to protect as many Palestinian civilians as possible. I noticed that they still end that phrase in some way, shape, or form with, but Israel has a right to defend itself.
It took me a while. I think that that is actually a brilliantly constructed phrase, because I asked a bunch of questions beginning last November about, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to the occupied territories? And they wouldn't answer, which led me to the obvious conclusion that they don't recognize the Geneva Conventions apply everywhere on the planet, but they don't apply to the Palestinians, who desperately need it because it's largely about, people under occupation. But the funny thing is about the Geneva Conventions, the people who are occupied have a legal right, whether you think it's moral or not. They have a legal right to resist the occupation. So that they're saying, so Israel does not have a right to defend itself legally against the Palestinians. It has a right to defend itself against Syria or Iran or other countries. But if you're occupying a people and you're a country occupying, somebody else's land, you legally don't have a right to defend yourself. So them saying Israel has a right to defend itself is actually a backhanded way of saying we don't recognize the Fourth Geneva Convention as applying. So I think that they have this kind of insider speak. It's repetitive, but it actually means something, even though it's not what it seems to be saying. But it actually does have a deeper meaning sometimes.
That's a really good point. What do you think about the way that a lot of not just the State Department, but also the press secretary, they have been running cover for Joe Biden? His condition, obviously, we can see what's happening right in front of our eyes, but they have found a way to continue the narrative that Joe Biden just had one bad night of that debate. Of course, we know we've seen the debate, the interview actually that he had with George Stephanopoulos, so we know that that's not true. And I've been seeing this for quite some time since the 2020 Democrat primary debates. Actually, I called it back then that Joe Biden didn't seem like he was the same, that there was some type of decline that was happening there. What do you think about that? Like the way that they run cover and try to protect Joe Biden as if the American people are crazy and we can't see what's happening right in front of us.
Yeah, I think a couple of things are going on at the same time. One is, as you're absolutely saying, this decline has been evident for some time, and there is the clique immediately around Biden are pretending that there isn't a cognitive issue going on there. But I'm also very skeptical about why this came up right now. Consider that this all started with the debate with Trump. Now, this is unprecedented for them to have had a debate this early in the season. They always have these debates, and they were always put on, or they have been for decades, put on by this so-called Commission on Presidential Debates. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party spent a lot of time and effort building up. They took the debates away from the League of Women Voters. They put all this effort, and then suddenly they decided they didn't want to do that this year. Suddenly they decided we're going to debate Trump early before the conventions, and then the issue became his cognitive decline. I think this was a strategic choice, and it accomplished a couple of things. It made it prevented by the continual denial, prevented, like if they had acknowledged, if all of the people that are acknowledging it right now had acknowledged it a year ago, that would have opened the door to a primary process in the Democratic Party, actual some minimal semblance of democratic process in the so-called Democratic Party. That didn't happen. They prevented that from happening by their denial. All of the people, all of the Tom Friedmans and all the New York Times, all of these, mainstream people who are now saying it was a thing, not like you and, other people on the left who have been calling this for years, but all the people who are suddenly calling it over the last couple of weeks, their denial up until this point prevented a meaningful democratic process in the Democratic primary, which should have happened this year. And I think it's very similar to how they rigged the primaries in 2016 and 2020. Each cycle, they find a new game plan to rig the process. And now it's almost a good thing for them to have this debate because they've effectively rebranded Genocide Joe into Geriatric Joe. He's Mr. Magoo. He's a feeble old man, and he's standing with the world and standing with NATO, and he's trying to end the war in Gaza. That's their line. Whereas in fact, he's somebody, he's been a front man for empire and has provoked Russia, helped start the Ukraine war, is massively complicit, if not outright guilty, of the genocide in Gaza. So this is a conversation this is a shift that they want to have happen. And they want this to be the focus in the debate. It's like a horse race, it's a vacuous horse race debate without a choice. It's not like a horse race between him and Bernie Sanders during the election, where you could actually say, okay, maybe there's a meaningful difference in a choice. Here, it's just making him the issue as it is.
That's right. And another thing that I've noticed as well, in particular when it comes to the media, one of the things that I've noticed is that they tend to get the story correct late. Typically after independent media has already corrected the record. And this puts me into the Hannibal directive. This story that was revealed by Haaretz, well, I would say actually it was revealed by independent media first after October 7th. The Gray Zone, the Electric Intifada, they were calling this out very, very early on. And of course, they were referred to as conspiracy theorists. That's usually how it goes. But now Haaretz they've written an article, this is an Israeli outlet, acknowledging that Israel implemented the Hannibal directive on October 7th. So for those who are not aware what that is, basically that is a strategic effort by the IDF where if they feel there is a need to do so, they may kill their own people to prevent them from being captured by Hamas. They would rather kill their own people to avoid capture, etc. But again, independent media was talking about this right after October 7th, and a lot of these people were shut down, whether it was on social media or by mainstream media pundits, and they were called conspiracy theorists. When you look at the article that was just written by Haaretz about the Hannibal directive, that really does change the narrative for corporate media, because that means that they have to acknowledge now that some of the people that were killed on October 7th, some of the Israelis that were killed by the IDF, which means Israel killed some of their own people. How do you think the State Department will try to find a way to defend that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they will try to find it. I mean, I asked about the Hannibal directive last month, and Matt Miller pretended that he didn't know about it. He just outright said, "Yeah, that I think he said that alleged or that supposed directive." I don't know. And then he quickly went to one of those people that quickly shifted the discussion to another subject. So I was, I was actually said to him a couple of times, you say you don't, you're saying you don't know what the Hannibal directive is, and he wouldn't answer that. So since then, another reporter who gets called on more frequently did ask about the Haaretz article, and they just simply said that they read it but didn't give any substantial answer. They will perpetually say something like, we're looking into that. We're working on our own independent assessment, and we're aware of these media reports, that kind of thing. When I actually asked it, I highlighted not only, first off, people should understand how insidious the Hannibal directive is. What it's actually saying is, we don't want to negotiate in good faith in any way, shape, or form with these Palestinians. So if they grab something that we want, what some of our people, especially military people, but any people, we're going to kill them to prevent the Palestinians from having any meaningful leverage in a negotiating situation. Because in the past, when Palestinian groups did capture an Israeli soldier, Israel has tons, thousands of Palestinians in indefinite detention. They're not charged with a crime. Some of them are, and they're kind of kangaroo courts, but some of them aren't even charged with a crime. Some of them are being held just simply because they're family members of somebody who the Israelis want to get. So how is that exactly different than a quote unquote hostage? So they're willing to kill their own people. And I asked about, the Hannibal directive being used on October 7th, and it has a history. It wasn't just used on October 7th. It's been used in the past. But I also asked, given that there are still US citizens being held in Gaza, is it possible that it's currently in play and that it may be targeting US citizens? So you would think that the US State Department would take an interest in a military directive by an alleged ally that could put a target on US citizens. And that's when they denied knowing anything about it. I was a little surprised that they went that far, but I should have seen it coming.
No, they don't care about us either. They don't care
No,
about
no, no. I
you.
knew that, but yeah, yeah,
No, it's
yeah.
interesting too, because I do feel like you mentioned the Palestinian detention center. I remember that CNN, they ran an expose on that, and I was actually surprised that they were covering that information. But I
Mhm.
feel like there were two investigative reports that CNN did that I saw. One was the Palestinian Detention Center, and the other one was the supposed tunnels that Israel said that Hamas had. And it was revealed that, there were the mass graves that were, pulled up by the IDF. I was surprised that they did that, but I also realized that without the massive protests that were happening across the world, I don't think CNN does those reports. There was so much pushback from the American people. And I don't think that the Biden administration expected that response from the people here in this country after October 7th. I think they are still stuck in like 2003-ish, after 9/11, where a lot of Americans did fall in line with what the US government wanted and did cheer on this war after 9/11. A lot of Americans did cheer it on. There were protests, but I think more people fell into the lie and believed the narrative that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But this time around, they did not receive that response. And I think they did not know how to handle that because I don't think they were prepared for that and that would be the outcome. When I look back at those protests, like we're talking thousands of people out in the streets spreading all over across the world. And I feel like that's what pushed corporate media to try to do some type of investigative journalism around Gaza.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that it does have an effect. But I think what the system, both the political system and the media system, they're always trying to be one lie ahead, so that they will create, it's like stages of a rocket, so like they will acknowledge that something was a lie, 3 months, that was the main story of the day 3 months ago, and they've sort of moved on to the current lie. Um, and I think part of the current lie now is the whole so-called ceasefire proposal that Biden put forward. The timeline of this also is, very important. South Africa went to the International Court of Justice invoking the Genocide Convention against Israel. And the court came back in February and said Israel must stop all genocidal acts. And then people debated, okay, what does that mean? Does it have to stop everything? Da, 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 da. And then South Africa kept going back to the court. They kept going back, seeking new orders, more direct orders. And then finally, in late May, they got the court to say Israel must stop its offensive in Rafah. Um, and the Biden administration at the time was claiming that they were against Israel going into Rafah, but they claimed that it wasn't happening. That the attacks on Rafah didn't constitute a full invasion. The court determined that the invasion started on May 7th, and they issued their orders that it needs to stop on May 24th. Then a bunch of countries in the UN Security Council started setting up, a resolution to implement that order because that's what's supposed to happen. The International Court of Justice is like a court, and the UN Security Council is like a sheriff. It's supposed to implement what the court says. Um, and then that's when Biden got up and said, Israel has put forward this ceasefire proposal, and we're on our way. And then they conned the UN Security Council into passing a resolution backing their alleged ceasefire plan. It's now how many, a month and a half later, or Yeah, about a month and a half later, and still no ceasefire. It's a phony process that they've put into place. And they claimed that it was an Israeli plan at the beginning. Now they've dropped that claim that it's an Israeli plan. Biden, in his remarks at his NATO news conference, described it as his plan, and that there's still details to be worked out between uh, Hamas and the Israelis. And during the debate, he claimed that it was all Hamas's fault. Um, so that's the con. They've taken. People were all out in the streets saying ceasefire now, ceasefire now, ceasefire now, and then they try to co-opt that language and to say, yeah, we're for a ceasefire. See, we're trying to be good guys. We're trying to do the right thing. When it's all this insidious game that they're playing in order to try to undermine international law so that they control the machinations of what happens when.
I hear you. I saw something similar during the George Floyd protests. I felt like the
Ah,
same thing. They co-opted the language.
yeah, no, no, absolutely, and the imagery as well and everything. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that brings me to the campus protests. You wrote an article here for Consortium News. Did Columbia University violate the First Amendment? And this is a really good point here. I think, there were a number of college campuses that had these encampments in the protests, but Columbia University definitely was the spotlight. One of the things that you said here, although Columbia University is a private institution not governed by the First Amendment, the first role of state actors, in this case, members of Congress, is instigating the action that would raise serious First Amendment concerns. I want to talk a little bit about that because it was very jarring to me that Congress would get involved with university activity.
Right. Um, this is a legal issue that was initially brought to my attention by the former head of the ACLU. And what the argument is that the 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 government cannot use a non-government actor in order to stifle free speech. And there's some court precedent on this. For example, um, the original court case involved a bookstore in Massachusetts that displayed a book in its, window that the government didn't like. So
I
the
just want to
government,
say, of course, it would be here.
yeah, oh, are you in
it's it's
Massachusetts?
it's
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
Massachusetts.
So the local government kept slapping fines on this bookstore, obviously in an attempt to coerce it into getting rid of the book. Um, and so similarly, you saw members of Congress saying that federal funding for Columbia University should be cut if they don't shut down the protests. A whole series of statements by different members of Congress along those lines. Um, and this concept, I think, really needs to be examined and fleshed out because it also has implications in terms of big tech. All of these big tech platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Google, all of them are in effect becoming agents of censorship, um, acting either being coerced by the government or acting in collusion with it in order to shut down different types of free speech. So I think this is a major issue that needs to be confronted.
This is why I used to work in higher ed administration, and this is one of the things that I struggled with for over a decade, which was the fact that the universities don't actually belong to the students or the administration, and the students are the customers, and that's who these universities serve. But at the end of the day, they're all attached to big money interest, and that's where a lot of the decision making comes from. And so when I saw this happening at Columbia University, the first thing I said is, oh, watch, people are going to, or the donors are going to start to threaten to pull their funding from Columbia University. So, of course, I saw people like the Patriots owner, Robert Kraft, make a statement. A lot of these people, they donate to multiple institutions. So they donate to Columbia, also Harvard, and starting to make threats there to pull their funds. And usually it is the money that will push those universities to change their course. I've seen it happen multiple times.
Yeah, yeah. And oftentimes I think that there's a dynamic of, like tuition pays for the fixed cost, the light bill, but and then the big donors come in and they get to determine the actual policy, what programs are done, and so on. So they end up steering what actually happens and the direction that a university takes, whereas students, are just paying the fixed costs, basically.
Do you think the censorship that's happening on the campuses, do you think that that will, I guess, push more so younger people to have less trust in the university system?
It should. It should make them very skeptical of a lot of aspects of it, of universities and other major institutions. I hope that the protests, I mean, we're obviously in the summer now, but I really would hope that, that students are and other people are able to continue protests and finding, you know, new and creative targets. You have the group Palestine Action, which is targeting military companies that are helping Israel directly. Um, I was in New York recently, and there were some protests in front of the U.S. mission to the UN. I think targets like that are really important. The U.S. mission is right across the street from the main UN building, and it's primed to, have very effective protests there. So I think, and I hope that people will think really creatively about what targets need to be, really exposed.
I also think about the way that corporate media chose to talk about these protests and the
Mhm.
encampments.
Mhm.
And this time it was on both sides. And I compare it to the George Floyd protests. When the media covered George Floyd, it was very obvious that the liberal media, CNN, MSNBC News, was more in favor of the protest compared to conservative news like Fox News.
Sure.
However, when it came to these protests in particular, I noticed that both sides of corporate media were condemning the students, especially when the encampment started. Whether it was Morning Joe, whether it was, CNN, they were heavily against the students that had the encampments. And from what I saw, most of the encampments were peaceful. It was the outside agitators that came onto campus that made it, violent. But most of the people at the encampments, it was peaceful. And the corporate media painted it in such a way to make it seem like the protesters at the encampments were the violent ones. And again, it wasn't until I felt like there was more push from independent media and other outside factors to get CNN to do an investigation about what happened at UCLA, where they did have Zionist protesters come out and attack those students that were at those camps. But again, I feel like they had to have that push or that pressure from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. The counter protesters were almost always violent, the violent party, and there was a very concerted effort. I remember it well. I don't remember the date, but Biden in the morning made a statement regarding, um, protesting is okay, but you can't be violent. Insinuating heavily, if not outright lying, and saying that the anti-genocide protesters were the ones being violent. And that became the mantra for that day. I went into the State Department that day, and it was fascinating. They actually took a bunch of questions on policy of Palestine. They appear to be very open that day in terms of policy, but they went to some of their favorite journalists to frame the protests as violent and like hoodlums, because that was the important story of the day. They had to determine that narrative after Biden made his statement, to inculcate that into the American public to make them think that it was these pro-Palestinian protesters who were the violent ones. And you sort of saw a miniature version of that from Biden and some of the media recently when a, uh, a synagogue was used to, as a place to illegally sell Palestinian land. And people were protesting the auctioning off illegally under international law of Palestinian land. And then, Biden put out a statement saying, houses of worship are sacred and you can't be violent in front of, as if that's what's happening. And again, it was the opposite. The counter protesters were actually violent, and nobody was protesting a synagogue. They were protesting it being used, I believe, on a Sunday um, uh, for um, for auctioning off Palestinian land.
There's also been anti-Muslim sentiment from corporate media as well. And I think the first time I saw this heavily was after 9/11. I do feel like during that time, a lot of Americans bought into that. They bought into the anti-Muslim rhetoric. I don't think this country at that point in time was a really safe place for people that were Muslim. And fast forward to October 7th, and I'm seeing the same media narratives again, the way that they are describing Muslim people. And again, that was before the protest. Once the protest heavily started, then I feel like they started to, okay, let's show some type of sympathy for the Palestinian people and say, well, no, they're not all dangerous or whatever. But I still felt like even the way that they were describing Hamas was also incorrect. But once again, there's this anti-Muslim sentiment that I get. Again, I feel like the corporate media, they are the ones that create the narrative. They are the ones that basically get the people riled up to be against one group or the other, when in reality, if you look at what is happening on the ground, you can see that, again, a lot of the younger people didn't buy into this. And I think, again, corporate media didn't know how to handle that this time around, because after 9/11, I feel like more people, most Americans for the most part, again, just got in line with the corporate narrative. But that was also before social media. This time around, not so much. And it's really disturbing to me to see how they can still be so biased towards a group of people in this particular situation, the Palestinian people that are occupied and are oppressed. And at the same time, some of those same networks were defending the protest during George Floyd.
Yeah, what you say about, it came from both the right wing and the, corporate liberal MSNBC, CNN type is totally true. It might be couched in a slightly different way, but it was definitely there. Um, I mean, it was very skilled. The propaganda, in a way, was very effective, but in a way also gives away how insidious everything is. The whole beheaded babies thing from the get-go. Okay, why did they put that out? Why did they put that lie out? They put that lie out because they knew that there would be beheaded Palestinian babies. It's always accuse your opponent of what you're going to do, because they've been doing this before. They bombed the hell out of Gaza over and over again in 2009, in 2014, in 2021. Not as big as this, but they bombed the hell out of Gaza over and over again. So they knew what was going to happen. And there's always been something of a backlash, some sense of outrage amongst certain parts of the population globally, as well as in the U.S. Over these massacres. So they knew that they were going to, slaughter even more Palestinians this time, and so they had to put out a propaganda line that the Palestinians came in and they beheaded babies and they raped women. I mean, it's classic, war propaganda in order to justify killing innocent people. You so demonize the other side that people will go along with anything that you do to them. And I think that that's what was enacted. And it was, unfortunately, I think, largely effective. It delayed, I mean, there have been protests and a lot of people saw through it right at the beginning, but I think a lot of people were either taken aback or sitting on the fence or confused or whatever. And it took them a while to figure out who's who's really slaughtering who here. And I mean, I'm sure that Hamas killed a lot of people on October 7th, but I think that their main goal was to take as many Israeli, especially soldiers, captive so that they would have leverage because they know that Israel will never negotiate in good faith until they have something like that. That was clearly their goal. And as we know, with the Hannibal directive, a lot of the civilians that were killed that day were the result of Israel slaughtering people because they don't want the Palestinians to have any leverage in the situation. They want them to be completely powerless so that they can do whatever the hell they want.
That's right. And those, the hostages that were um, the Israelis citizens that were captured by Hamas. From what I understand, the idea was we will exchange them for the Palestinian hostages that you've been keeping and detaining for years. No process, no legal process has happened. This is the thing I've tried to explain to people as well. I'm like, I don't think Americans really understand a lot of the Palestinian like prisoners. These people have not been brought forth to a court. They've not been convicted. They're just detained. And if you look at the treatment between the way that they've been treated after they've been detained and you look at the hostages that were released by Hamas, you can see the big difference. It's obvious that the Palestinian prisoners have been tortured. When Hamas released the prisoners that they released, you notice that they seemed just fine. They were smiling. They looked healthy, despite that there are other people starving in Gaza right now. A lot of them are starving. But when you saw the Palestinian prisoners that were released by the IDF, they looked sick. They looked tortured, beaten, very frightened. You could see the difference.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Israel, that's another thing that, still hasn't gotten through into the major media, for example. That's exactly the kind of lie that, I mean, maybe somewhat, like you said, the torture facilities and so on, there's been some coverage of that, but I don't think that the extent of, and how long Palestinians have been held, it's a very galvanizing issue throughout Palestinian society. And the fact that Hamas is demanding other Palestinians, not just Hamas people, but all Palestinians, be released, including people like Barghouti and others who are, political leaders who could be unifying figures for the Palestinians. The U.S. and the Israelis have done a good job in fracturing Palestinian groups, in part by imprisoning people who could be unifying figures. So that's part of the demand here.
Do you know if the State Department had any comment towards that report that came from CNN about the Palestinian detention center?
I don't remember that. I don't recall that
Mhm.
being asked. I don't go to all the briefings, but I don't recall that being asked. I'll try to keep an eye out for that. That's a good question.
Yeah, only because that one was released by corporate media. So that's why I'm curious what they would say about that. But July 24th, Benjamin Netanyahu is set to come to Congress if that still continues to happen. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I noticed he has canceled on other countries recently, but he is coming here July 24th, I believe, to ask Congress for more money. Just like Zelensky comes here and asks for more money.
Mhm.
Do you anticipate any media restrictions on that day that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to appear? Because there is also a protest that is being sponsored by Answer Coalition as well.
Yeah, I think I haven't followed this closely, but I think that Answer Coalition, which has organized some of the largest protests, has made it, has made a goal that they're going to surround the Capitol, that they will literally prevent Netanyahu from going there. So I expect that they will have some mechanism to uh, force him through, and I suspect that that could mean, civil liberties violations. Even with the NATO conference, I was just driving around D.C. Tons of fences, buildings being surrounded, streets being cut off, all kinds of um, uh, procedures are done, like to real lockdown situation that they will implement. And Netanyahu has spoken several times, I think at least once before, to Congress. And a few members will not go or object in some way, but it's mostly a incredible I don't want to say love fest because there's nothing loving about it, but just standing ovation after standing ovation for this foreign leader of a country that's perpetrating a genocide, that's an apartheid regime, that's sponging off the U.S. taxpayer, and committing massacre after massacre. It really does show that in so many ways, Israel is, the U.S.-Israeli relationship sort of embodies the worst parts of the United States. It's the colonial, settler colonial, um, uh, you know, uh, attack the indigenous population and to keep the colonial project going. That is effectively what I think is at the heart of the U.S.-Israeli relationship and why it's a special relationship and why it's something that needs to be confronted. Because I don't think that the settler colonial project is finished. And we just saw with the NATO meeting, they're targeting Asia. They're targeting Africa. They have waged wars in both Africa and Asia, Libya and Afghanistan. Those were done under NATO auspices. So is the colonial project really over? Has decolonization really happened? Or if they succeed in driving out Palestinians yet again, if they succeed in continuing to expand Israel as a settler colonial state, what's on the horizon for Asia and Africa, given the commitment that they obviously have to this NATO alliance?
And this is something I've brought up before too, as well, is that I feel like it's still, yeah, to your point, it's still continuing. And I think a lot of people just haven't been paying attention, especially when it comes to countries in Africa as well. But I sincerely hope that more people are waking up to what's happening around the world and how the US we have our part in it. At least our government does, and why we should care about those issues. One more question for you, Sam. Do you foresee an end to this before the election in November, or do you think that Netanyahu and Biden are going to try to drag this out?
I just wrote a column on this. What I fear is going to happen, and I don't know that this is going to happen. The National Security Advisor of Israel said that it's going to go on till the end of the year. And so far, Biden and Blinken and company have effectively greenlighted, every war crime and crime against humanity that Israel has done. What they seem to have not allowed is an ethnic cleansing. And they've said that they don't want the Palestinians in Gaza to be forced out into Egypt, although they did fund a tent city in Egypt. My concern is that the transition period, especially, may be an opening for Netanyahu to do that, and that a president or a president-elect Trump may greenlight that. So that, that's clearly the Israeli goal. They'll take what they can get. And I disagree with some of my friends who say that Israel's losing. Israel's winning. Israel's winning because it's decimating Palestinian society. That's its goal. Its goal isn't to destroy Hamas. Its goal isn't to get the hostages. Its goal is to inflict as much damage as possible on Palestinian society because it's a settler colonial state and it seeks to expand. So I'm very concerned that, as you point, the end of the year could well be a period in which Israel attempts to do that. They would have to buy off Egypt in some way, at least to be a jumping off point for the people driven out. And what they seem to be wanting to do is continually bomb the Palestinians, make them to move to this place, make them move to the south, make them move back to the north, bomb them again, keep bombing them so that they become accustomed to moving, so that they're begging to just simply have tents. And you try to, I mean, bravery has been incredible of the Palestinians on the ground, but they're trying to break their will so that they can eventually force them out. And Jared Kushner said a couple months ago, "Wow, that's some beautiful beachfront property there," and they want it, and it is. I've been there. I was stunned at how beautiful Gaza is. So that is one of my lead concerns.
Sam Husseini, thank you so much for coming on.
One last thing, if I could. At the beginning, you said I get to do something nobody else does, and go to the State Department. They're very unfair, but they're remarkably open. Other journalists, I actually spent a good deal of time asking other journalists, why don't you do that? Why don't you do that? Until I finally said, well, what the hell? I'm just going to do it myself. So I know you're not in DC, but when you visit DC, you can, drop by and get in there, and so can other people. So just putting that out there.
Interesting. That is good to know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.